France is preparing for a big war. Could this war potentially escalate into World War III? Well, we're again at a point in history where if we want peace, we must be ready for war. On the 15th of March, 2024, President Emmanuel Macron of France delivered a speech. He issued a stark warning to all of Ukraine's allies, emphasizing that Russia wouldn't simply calm down after defeating Ukraine. According to Macron, the rest of the EU nations must be ready for a war. It really seems like France is gearing up for war. In fact, France has recently increased its military budget by 40%. Moreover, France has also been threatening Russia, saying they'll deploy troops in Ukraine. While France is getting increasingly aggressive towards Russia, Russia isn't staying quiet either. Russia has openly threatened all European nations. They've warned that if French troops step into Ukraine, only corpses will return to France. They also said French troops would face the same fate as Napoleon's army did. The situation is getting serious. Does this mean a war is coming, and could it trigger World War III? Because if France jumps into war as a NATO member, 30 more countries will get involved, and that could kickstart World War III. Historically, the entry of a major country into an existing conflict has often triggered larger wars. But why this sudden aggression from France toward Russia? After all, they were allies for years. Even when the conflict between Russia and Ukraine was at its peak, Macron had passed a statement that even if Russia dropped a nuclear bomb on Ukraine, France wouldn't attack Russia. Macron even went to Russia to negotiate with Putin to stop the Ukraine war. So, why this sudden shift? Well, the truth is, this conflict actually has nothing to do with Ukraine. It's happening far away in Africa. Both France and Russia are eyeing Africa as a potential colony. It might come as a surprise, but it's true. As of 2024, it might seem like every country is independent. But out of all the countries in Africa, 14 of them are still colonies of France. Yes, France still controls them. Now you will ask how this is possible. To understand this, let's go back to the 1960s, 64 years ago, when these 14 countries gained independence from France. Well, sort of. From 1830 to 1960, that's 130 years, France had these countries under its control. But in the 1960s, France granted them independence. However, France was clever about it. They signed many controversial agreements with these countries. Essentially, France gave them freedom, but in a strategic move, they signed agreements that kept these nations' economies, militaries, resources, and even their governments under French control. Did you know that even today, these African countries use a currency called the CFA franc, controlled by France? France controls the economy of these African nations through these agreements. For instance, all their reserves are stored in the Central African State Bank in Cameroon, fully controlled by France. And if these countries want to access their own money, France loans it to them. 85% of the money they repay goes straight back to France. Isn't it surprising that even many people don't know about this? It's like Europe's best-kept secret. We've created a detailed video on this topic, which you can find on our channel. France has control over these countries' militaries too. Even though they have their own armies, France has influence over the top military generals. Now let's talk about how France exploits African resources. These countries are rich in minerals like coal, gold, uranium, and diamonds. French troops are deployed around these mines to control these resources. French companies operate in these areas, and the finished goods are sent to France for profit. This is just scratching the surface. France signed agreements that ended colonialism, but it still earns around $500 billion from Africa through colonial taxes in the name of security. That's 6 times more than Sri Lanka's GDP. It's like they're still colonizing these countries, but in a different way. But why is all this still happening in the 21st century? Why aren't these countries protesting against this exploitation? Well, France has been very strategic. Puppet governments, often led by corrupt leaders, are propped up by France, suppressing dissent and ensuring French control. However, in recent years, there has been a surprising wave of anti-France protests and coups across these nations. In 2022, Mali and the Central African Republic protested, and in 2023, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad followed. All these countries had coups and overthrew their pro-France governments. But how? This sudden rebellion raises questions about how these countries after 60 years of French control, are now challenging their former colonizer. Who is supporting them? Who is instigating them against France? If you're thinking along these lines, you're on the right track. Take a look at some of their protests. Many countries have a slogan which means France out, Russia in. Why would they say that? Well, Russia saw an opportunity when it realized that despite France granting independence to its former African colonies, it still maintained control over them and their resources. Through various African media outlets, Russia spread a narrative. Africans were told that even though they gained independence 60 years ago, they were still slaves to France, who was exploiting their resources. But it wasn't just words. Russia provided military support to these countries. They supported armed rebels or the military in countries where the government was pro-France. The Wagner Group, essentially Russia's private army that works on Putin's orders, played a significant role. They helped overthrow governments in Niger and Mali, among others. Where these coups succeeded and pro-Russian governments were established, the new rulers praised Russia. They even turned to Putin for attendance. In Africa, people are waving Putin's photos and Russian flags. But why would Russia help Africa? As you all know, in geopolitics, there are no permanent friends or enemies, only permanent interests. So what's in it for Russia? They're doing what France used to do, exerting military and economic control. First, they're installing pro-Russian governments, making these countries dependent on Russia. Already, 7 out of 14 African countries are under pro-Russian governments, and more are on the way. And these African countries are paying Russia 6 billion CFA francs every month for military protection. Second, Russia is taking economic control. They're sending their Wagner Group to take over mineral resources. For example, in the Central African Republic, Russia is now controlling the Nasema gold mine. They export all the gold straight to Moscow, making a profit of $2.7 billion annually, just from one mine. And that's not all. Russia is also exploiting African timber, something even France didn't do. They're smuggling the famous virgin redwood of Africa. Just 1 foot of it is worth approximately $2,500, many times more than the price of gold. But why would African countries allow this? Well, they hope Russia will help them develop. Russia is clever, though. They want to be the big player in Africa, not the West. Why? Because at the UN, where African countries have a 28% vote share, they want those votes to go their way. You remember when Russia invaded Ukraine, right? Well, many African countries didn't even speak against it. Why do you think that is? Could it be that they're in Russia's pocket? And now France is gearing up for war against Russia. But wait, why? Let's look at it from France's perspective. It's not just about money, it's also about politics. Macron, the French president, is in a bit of a pickle. His popularity is dropping, and people are not happy with him. There are protests everywhere. So what does he do? He talks about going to war with Russia because he thinks it will make him look strong, like a hero. But honestly, I don't think a war is going to happen. The people of France, whether they support Macron or not, don't want it. They're saying Macron should go to Ukraine alone. But let's not paint Russia as the only villain here. They're offering help to African nations too. It's a complex dance of interests, and depending on whose perspective you hear, the story changes. So what do you think? Who's right and who's wrong? Let me know in the comments below. If you find this video interesting, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe.